Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm an MVP for Office Servers and Services and Office Development. In this module, we're going to look at cards and actions using Outlook Actionable Messages. Specifically, we're going to cover the design guidelines, text formatting, cards and fields, section fields, actions, and inputs, and all related to the message card playground. The message card playground is a place for us to look at samples and design our own cards to see what they're going to look like inside of a mail client. You can find this at messagecardplayground.azurewebsites.net. What it's going to allow you to do is at the top you can see where we can select an existing sample like a Twitter hero message or some GitHub information. There's a bunch of different samples available to us. At the top you can see where you can even load in your own sample. On the left-hand side of the pane, we can see the JSON that will be related to our card that we can specify that we want to have rendered. On the right-hand side, we can see a preview of the rendering that would show up. We can then send the information by logging into Azure AD and saying I want to send via email this card. Now what that would do is that's going to send an email to the email address that I specify, and then I can open it up in my email client to see what that's going to look like. Or I could send it via a webhook. This is going to give us a really good way to test our rendering of what it's going to look like before we actually create one of our cards. Here's what a card's going to look like once we receive it inside of our mail client. And in this case here, I'm using the Outlook web client, but a lot of mail clients support these new actionable messages. I'm going to send the card to my inbox to view and test the card. Note that in HTTP post URLs to process the actions won't work yet until I register them within the developer dashboard. And I'm going to cover those in the next section of this module. But here you can see that when I select one of these existing cards, it's going to show me the card rendering the same one that we were just looking at on the previous slide. Let's talk a little bit about the text formatting and what we can do with some basic markdown controls. We can do a lot of different formatting with some of the different fields that are available to us, like the title or the text. We can italicize something by using a single star or an asterisk around the content we want italicized. If we double up the asterisks, we can make that text bold. And if we want it bold italics, then we can put the 2 plus the 1 star on either side of it. And what that does is that first bolds it and then italicizes it, or the other way around. It depends on how you want to look at it, but it's still just going to italicize and bold the text. To do a strike through, you're going to use a double tilde on either side of the text. And to create a link, you're going to create the name of the link or the thing you want hyperlinked. So in this case here, Microsoft, you'll put that in square brackets. And then immediately following that, you'll put the URL of where you want them to go when they click on it in parentheses. For a heading, you can do an H1 all the way down to an H6. So H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. You can do that by using a hash symbol to go in front of the text. So you would generally put a hash symbol followed by a space and then the text that you want to show up as a heading. And it will show everything on that line will be made a heading. For a bulleted list, the way you'll do that is you'll separate them by new lines. So each list item that you want bulleted would start with either a dash or an asterisk. And it really depends on what syntax you want to use, but you have to use the same value for each one of the bulleted items. So to start the list, make sure you break it with a new line or have an empty line both at the beginning and at the end of your items. We have a couple different fields that we can specify in our card. One of them, the hide original body, is useful if the card itself contains all of the information a user would need or if the content of the card is redundant with the content of the body. You're always going to include an HTML body that is rendered for clients that don't support these actionable cards or actionable messages. That's a good idea because you want to make sure that your user can actually see something. And it's kind of like putting in a title field or a text field or an alternate field attribute on images in an HTML web page so that you can, if the images don't render, they can still see what should be there. You should not use, as a good guideline, you should not use hyperlinks or markdown in the title, but you can use hyperlinks and markdown in the text. Now we also have section fields, and so section fields are going to allow us to create different sections within our card. Now you should not use hyperlinks in the title of your section. An example for, like, say, a news article abstract is I would use the activity image to display a picture associated with the article, an activity subtitle to display the date and time an article was originally posted, use activity text to display the actual abstract, And I'm going to use facts to present metadata, such as the publish date, image credits, and other citation data. Now, actions are going to allow us to do something inside of the card. And an action's got a couple different things that we can do. We have an open to URI, an HTTP post, and an action card. An open to URI is going to open up a URL in a separate browser or an application if the URL is crafted using some sort of a protocol that is known on the device that we're using. An HTTP post is going to make a call to an external web service or endpoint. And an action card is going to present additional UI that contains one or more outputs or inputs, such as text, date, or multi-choice, and an action, such as an open to URI or an HTTP post. And so that may be useful. In this case here, what you see on the right-hand side, an action card, what this is doing is that when it's named approve, and what happens is that when I click the approve button, that's going to open up this other section here for an action card, which is going to allow me to put in some text for a reason if I want to approve or reject it, and then have another action for submitting the actual approval request. Now let's talk about some of the different inputs that we can collect here. We have three different kinds of inputs. We have a text input, which is useful when you want to provide answers or get your user to give you some feedback as text. It sort of gives us the way to make an email address or an email that they receive a little more structured. The date input is going to be used when you need your users to provide a date and or a time. And a multi-choice input is when they need to select from a list of predefined choices. So that's kind of self-explanatory. Let's take a look at a demo of working with the Message Center Playground. The Message Card Playground provides a sandboxed environment where you can design and test your cards. You can choose from some of the existing samples, and you can see there's a lot of different samples that you have available to you. One of the simplest one is the Twitter hero image. So I'm going to select that one. And for each one of these are different types of images or different cards that are available to us. There's a Twitter hero image. Here's a Twitter individual tweet. One without an image. We can also see what one looks like, say, for GitHub, an issue that has been opened. So you can see different things like adding a comment or closing or viewing GitHub. So let's go back to the Twitter hero image. So these are different things you could use as a starter point to get familiar with how these things work. So on this one, the activity title, you can see that the activity title is SpaceX. You can see there on the right-hand side. The subtitle, you can even see that we have the other, at SpaceX, just a little bit of text there. But if you go back to the activity title, you can notice Markdown, and it gives you kind of an interactive experience. Different elements support Markdown. So the title is one of those that you can use Markdown for. So one of the things we're going to try and do is we're going to try and mimic an existing card as a demonstration. So let's grab another SpaceX tweet. So after a month-long stay, Space Station, Dragon returns to Earth on September the 17th. So you can see some additional properties from this tweet. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy some properties of this, and we're going to use that information to customize a card sample. So let's go back to the Message Card Playground. And what I'm going to do is change some properties here. So our message card title, our activity title, and subtitle are mostly the same, but we're going to change our subtitle here to our different date for the other tweet we just saw. And we can see that our date changed over there on the right-hand side. And instead of our text here for the text, let's copy from another window here. So I'll change the text value here to the activity text to be equal to this new text we just added here. So after a month-long stay at the space station, Dragon returns to Earth on September 17th. And here you can see that we can change the properties to reflect and even change things like the hero image that shows up. So the hero image, let's go grab that URL for the image that they used. And let's use the one inside this other tweet that we were trying to mimic. So I'll paste that in, and there we go. We can see the Dragon capsule. This is how you're going to provide data inside of your card. And You'll grab the data from whatever source you're going to do, and then you're going to put that inside the card that can then be made available to your end user. So then we can also give our card some different actions. Now, we have 3 different actions. We have a HTTP post, another post, and then we can open a URI to do things like liking, retweeting, and viewing it in Twitter. So this last one, you click view on Twitter, the target is going to provide the URL to that tweet. So if I go grab the URL to that tweet and come over and paste that in, so now when you click view in Twitter, it'll open it up in Twitter. So to test it, I can send it to myself via email. So it's going to ask me what email you want to send. So I'm going to use my test account here. So it's going to ask for permissions here, saying that it needs to be able to do certain things like this playground here is a separate app. So this app, it needs permissions to stuff to my mailbox. So here I'm going to go ahead and send this off. So now the card was sent to the user. So now if I go check my email, I should see there's an email from the MOD administrator. There's a test card. And when I select it, I should see my card that was just sent. There's all different properties on it. There's the date. There's the message that we have. There's the hero image. And then I have those 3 different actions. And if I click on the view in Twitter, that should take me to the URL that we had for the tweet. So what this just demonstrated was how to customize an existing card to show some information from another source. Now we can explore a couple other samples. So there's a lot of other samples that we can actually go start customizing and see the differences here. The lab is going to walk you through a couple different examples, but I just wanted to show you in this one demo how to take one of our existing samples and take some data and update it so that you can see what the experience is like here. So let's have another one that's going to use Microsoft Flow and work with an approval. So this one is going to work to be an approval process. And we're going to change this up a little bit to see our needs or to suit our needs. So we're going to use it for an expense report. So I'm going to bulk change a bunch of things here. So I'm just going to copy and paste in a whole new change here for our approval. So you can see here, this one says, let's please approve our expense report, and then provide a link to an expense report. And then we have a action such as approve and reject. If I click on approve, I can then put a reason in and then click submit. And if you look over here at the code where this is coming from here, if I have my approve action, so here's my action card as my type, the approve is my name. The first input that I have here is a text input. And so the type there on line 45 is the type equals text input. And then we have a prompt there for a reason optional as a text that's going to show up. You see it's also set up as a multi-line. So that's why I get the extra large box. And then I have a list of actions. In this case here, I have just one, which is just an HTTP post for a submit button. And then the target is where it's going to be sent to. And so in this case here, it's going to go to an Azure web app. And the Azure web app is going to be a web API controller that I can pass in things like the ID and the action, which can be used to programmatically approve this. We can also reference things from the card itself. So we had a text input named comment. So for the body, we can actually send a string primitive, and that's why we have that equals prefix there. And what that will do is that will send the value of what's ever in that comment text box as the body to our HTTP post payload. So we can send that dynamically to the web application or to the web API for use. And then you can see here I can not only control the query string as well as the body, but I can also configure any headers in the HTTP request. And so here I'm able to pass in the content type. So I can pass in application and the form URL encoded. And this is different from the previous example that we saw earlier where I was using a browser to see what the action is. In this case here, I'm actually able to submit a real HTTP post action. So let's test this out by clicking send via email, and this will send the card to our inbox that we can take a look at. If I go back and look at the card, You can see I have in my email, I have a new card that shows up from Flow. And you can see here's our full approval for this expense report. And if I click the approve button, I can put in a reason. So I can go through and put a little reason here. Now this is going to fail because it's not pointing to a valid endpoint in that Azure function. And you can see it says it couldn't be completed. And the reason for that, again, is because I don't have that web application stood up as an Azure function where it's actually posting to. It was just, you saw it had that place where you can actually had to replace some values. And therefore there's nothing is accepting the response. Nobody's giving us a response, and we'll see how to set that up in later demos. Now let's take a look at sending actionable messages. So we want to look at this in a couple different ways. We can send an actionable message using a webhook, using email or SMTP, or via the Microsoft Graph. Now, if you want to create an incoming webhook in your Office 365 inbox or in the Office 365 group settings, you're going to have to click the gear icon and choose Manage Connectors. On the Connectors page, you're going to choose an incoming webhook and then click the Add button. On the incoming webhook page, you're going to provide a name and an image for the webhook, and then you're going to click Create. The resulting URL is going to allow you to post a JSON message containing an actionable message card data to the endpoint, causing an email to be sent to the user or to the Office 365 group for which the webhook is configured. So how does this process work? Actionable processing requires a publicly reachable endpoint that is pre-registered using the Actionable Email Developer Dashboard. You can't use localhost as a URL because that's unreachable from Office 365. So in the first step, the user is going to receive an email with an actionable message that is embedded in the script tag. The user is going to interact with that message action defined in the card, such as an HTTP post in step number 2. In step number 3, the HTTP post message is then sent to from Office 365 to the pre-registered endpoint. The HTTP post is going to include a bearer token that should be validated. In step 4, the status is returned in the HTTP post header as a card action status with a value indicating if it was a success or a failure. Now, optionally, the response can contain JSON to represent the new UI of the card as it's coming back in step number 5 and 6 after successful processing. This requires the card update and body HTTP header value with a value of true. So this is how it would work with a webhook. Now, as you'll see, when you do this via email, the process is basically the exact same. The only difference here is that I'm going to be sending an email directly to the user with the card itself. And so I'm just going straight through an email server, but outside of Office 365 or another system to get the card straight to the end user. When the user then gets the email, say using Outlook, which supports these different card messages, that's when the card's going to be rendered, and the rest of the communication is probably going to happen through Office 365 and my application. But this is just showing a difference. And instead of using the webhook model, I'm sending the card directly to the user via email. And then the last option is sending it also directly via email, but using the Microsoft Graph to send this. So here I have my application issuing an HTTP post to the Microsoft Graph v1 endpoint, and then I'm going to the current user, his messages collection, going to a specific mailbox, and then going to send. And what that's going to do is that's going to send an email directly to whoever the intended recipient is. But I'm doing it by sending an email through Microsoft Graph and the Office 365 servers. So let's take a look at a demo and see how this is actually implemented. So in the previous demonstration, I showed you how to design a card using some of the different playground templates that are available to us. Now I'm going to use that exact same JSON that I used in the previous demonstration. The one difference that we're going to see is that we're going to use an Azure Web App URL to handle the application submission. So here's all the stuff that we did in the previous demonstration, where we have things like our approval for our expense report. And you can see here's our approve button here on line 41 that's going to have a expando element for our input for our reason to post stuff in. And then I have my actions buttons And that you can see down a little bit farther is on line 56, where I've made a change here and actually pointing it to an actionable demo. So this is going to be an HTTP post to this endpoint, which is our Azure web app. And we can provide some information on the query string, like the ID and the action equals approve for our expense report. And in the body, again, I'm referencing the comment that was coming from the input box that you see up there that was defined on line 45, 46, 47, 48. And that's using a string literal here, using the equals prefix. And I'm also, so that's putting that in the body of the HTTP post. And then a little bit farther down in the header section, I'm still specifying the content type equals application form URL encoded. Now, if I scroll down, I also have a reject that does the exact same thing, where it's got a reason that I can say I want to reject it, and then I can still do a post over to our endpoint. So I'm going to jump back over to my resource group. I've already got a one already created for me. So I'm going to jump over to my actionable demo. And you can see here that I've got a URL set up here for mine called actionable demo azurewebsites.net. So I'm going to copy that and paste that into my card. And you saw that that's when my card URL action already was set up. So that's been set up. So just come back over here and just double check. Let's just look at my card that I created in the previous demonstration that we did, where before we were going to the Message Crown Playground. What I want to change is if I look down at the potential actions, you can see there on line 56, I'm pointing to the Azure website that we have created. So I've got the actionable demo. So now that we have the JSON in our and the Azure web app already stood up, let's jump over to PowerShell. And you see I'm using PowerShell to define two different parameters. So the first one is going to define a from and a to. Those are the two different parameters that we have that are defined. And then I'm going to generate an email header. Now the email header is just some HTML that's just going to provide some HTML wrapper around the card that I was just showing you a second ago. So you can specify things like the meta tag and the script tag. And the script is where we're going to be pointing in our application LD plus JSON. There you go. You can now see the script application /LD/JSON, and that's needed to wrap our card's JSON for something to understand what the JSON is. So then I'm using on line 14, I'm using get content to pull in the JSON from the card sample that we were just looking at a second ago, and then I'm going to close out the head practice. So here. I'm including a body tag. So this is always a best practice to include the body, because if I'm reading an email using an email client that does not support cards, then this is giving me an option to actually show them something that, they're missing something from this experience here. So you should put that in there just in case to make sure everything's there. Then I'm going to go concatenate these values together, the header, the body, and the footer. And then I'm going to prompt for the credential and then to send our mail message. Send mail message is part of just the general PowerShell API or command set. So then I'm just going to specify who the email's from and to, a subject, a body, pass the body off as HTML. That's going to make sure that my email is not sent as plain text. The SMTP server is where the mail is going to be routed through. The credential is coming from the Microsoft Office Online credential that we just fetched a moment ago. Setting a flag here to use SSL to send the email over port 587. So now I'm just going to go run this PowerShell command prompt, which is going to prompt us for the from address. So let me just paste in email. I'm going to send this to myself. So I'm going to log in, send it from admin, and I'm going to then send it to myself. So from myself to myself. And now I'm going to be prompted to authenticate. So I'm going to paste in my admin credentials. So then got my username in there and then pass in the password. So now that I've provided the credentials, and then it's going to send the mail message over. So let's go back to the browser and check our mail. So we have to just wait a moment for this to show up, and there we go. There's our message card. And here we go. Here's our message card. So there's our properties. We got our 2 actions there. So if I open up the approve, so I put our reason in here and then our submit button. So in the next demo, then I'm going to show you how to complete the entire loop to click the submit and have a web app that actually does something for us. Now let's look at processing actions from actionable messages. So in this section, we're going to talk about adding actions to cards, registering in the actionable email developer dashboard, registration criteria, and adding the Connect to Office 365 button to an existing website, validating the bearer token, reporting success or failure, and then talking a little bit about refresh tokens as well. Action processing requires a publicly reachable endpoint that is pre-registered using the actionable email developer dashboard. I'm not going to be able to use localhost as a URL because that's unreachable from Office 365. The way it's going to work is that in step 1, the user is going to receive an email with the actionable message embedded in the script tag. And then in step 2, the user is going to interact with the message that is defined in the card using something like an HTTP post. That post is going to be sent to Office 365, and then in step 3, it will then be sent via Office 365 to a pre-registered endpoint that I've whitelisted using the developer dashboard. The post includes a bearer token that should be validated. The card status is then returned in the HTML header card action status with a value indicating if it was successful or if it failed. We'll see this in a little bit in the slides in just a moment, as well as in a demo. Now, optionally, the response can include a JSON snippet to represent the new UI of the card after a successful process. This requires the card update and body HTTP header with a value equal to true. So how does this process work when you're doing it via email? Well, the process begins by your web application sending an actionable message to your email server. And this can be an Office 365 or another email server that meets the requirements. If you check the notes in the slides, you'll see I have a reference to a link of what other security requirements are there. If you go to docs.microsoft.com/en-us/outlook/actionable-messages/security-requirements, that's the link I'm talking about. A client capable of displaying message cards then displays the email. Clients not capable of displaying the message cards will only show the message body, so it's important as a best practice to include a meaningful message body. The card-enabled client, such as Outlook, is going to enable the user to click on an action, such as approve an expense report. This causes a message to be sent to Office 365. Office 365 then sends an HTTP post request to your application, adding an HTTP header authorization bearer plus the signed OAuth token, a JWT formatted token. Your application validates the token and then sends as the response an HTTP header indicating success or failure. And additionally, the body of the response can include a JSON snippet representing the new UI for the card. Finally, the full response is sent back to the email embedded or enabled client from Office 365. Now, although links can be achieved through Markdown, an OpenURI action has the advantage of allowing you to specify different URLs or URIs for different operating systems, which make it possible to open the link in an app or on mobile devices. For example, in this case here that you see, I can use the Yammer protocol to open the Yammer client on different platforms. Now, when an HTTP post action is executed, the post request is made to the URL in the target field, and the target service needs to authenticate the caller. This can be done in a variety of ways, including via a limited purpose token that's embedded in the target URL. Now, for more information on the security mechanisms and choosing the one that works best for your scenario, make sure you refer to the documentation on this. There's an article titled Security Requirements for Actionable Messages that I've already referred to once. Now, an HTTP post message or an HTTP post action in a card, either as a potential action or as an action with an action card element, provides properties that you can control the data being sent to your web API. And here we see the URL that is being posted to the HTTP body and an HTTP header indicating the content type of the data being processed. The handlebars syntax allows binding to other elements. Here we bind to the value of the comment input. Now note the equal sign preceding the value of the body. This is because our web API sample uses a primitive type instead of a complex type for ease of demonstration. Now consider creating a complex type and creating a view model to process it. Now, so for more information on posting form data to the web API, you can see the docs associated with this, which has a bunch of more information on how you can do this using web API. Now, your action URLs will not work until the URL has been registered in the Actionable Email Developer Dashboard. So the developer flow is generally to use the message card playground to view samples and design your own cards, then use the developer dashboard to register your providers, which is really just kind of whitelist different URLs that knows about. And then you're going to test your provider's actions. Every unique scope for things like mailbox, organization, or global must be registered individually. Now, developers aren't really blocked on the approval. They can send actual messages to themselves, or the cards will then just render the actions that would work without requiring an approval. This approval is only required to be able to send actual messages to other people. So if you want to send it just to yourself, no problem. It'll work just fine. But if you want to send it to anybody else, that's when you're going to need to go through and to get Microsoft to approve it. If you just select My Mailbox, it'll only work for your mailbox. That's the one that doesn't need any additional validation by Microsoft. But if you use organization or global for the different scopes, it's kind of covered up there on the slide, but it's in the step number 2. Those are the ones that are going to require Microsoft validation. Now, this section is really only applicable when your scope of your submission to enable actionable messages are global. Now, in this section, you need to provide details for Microsoft to verify the actionable messages and the corresponding actions that are invoked from the email sent to your provider or service. And additionally, send a valid email coming from your production servers or a server with a similar header that's required to include markup to verify. This procedure will enable Microsoft to determine that the solution complies with all the guidelines and requirements listed in the registration criteria. You're going to make sure that the markup is correct prior to sending the email. Microsoft or Office 365 will remove all markup when forwarding an email. So don't forward the email. You want to make sure you send this directly and not forward it. Now, Office 365 will call your configured URL, pass an authentication header with a value of bearer plus a signed encoded token. Your web API can inspect the bearer token and use the Microsoft.o365.actionablemessages.utilities NuGet package. There's a function called validate token async, and what it will do is first, the token will be issued by Microsoft and its digital signature is going to be validated. That's what it's first going to verify. It's also going to verify the token is not expired, and it's also going to verify that the audience claim matches the service domain URL that you specify. You can check the source for this library. There's a link to the source for this library on the Office Dev GitHub organization. And there's a link directly to the repo inside of the notes on the slide. Here's what you want to do when you're validating the bearer token that comes in. You'll first want to go through and validate the token using that actionable message token validator. And what that's going to do is first validate the token asynchronously. It's going to make sure that the parameters being passed in match the certain validation criteria. And if they don't, then I'm going to create a response to the card of unauthorized with a message of invalid token. Once I've then validated the token, I then want to validate that the message or the response coming from the sender or the performer of the message is valid. So in this case here, I'm checking to make sure that it's intended. It's like coming from and being sent to Contoso, and the person acting on it is from Contoso. If not, then I want to kick back a forbidden. So while we know the token's valid, we know that the user's not allowed to be doing this. So we'll kick back a forbidden error and saying it's an invalid sender or the performer is not allowed. And then finally, once everything's okay, then I want to do my business logic. And ultimately, I'm going to send a response of okay, and then whatever message I want to respond with. Now, what about reporting success or failure? Well, the way you're going to do this is with the card action status header. This is an HTTP header that you're going to want to include in your response, and this is what's going to tell the mail client that things worked or did not work. So in this case here, you can see if the code is equal to OK, then I'm going to return back a header of the card action status with the actual status that was passed in, or the message. If it was not, or if there was an error, then I'm going to create an error response. So you can see where the request create an error response, creating a new error response. And in that error that I'm passing back, I'm including a header, so a card action status with the message, and then I'm going to return back that error message. Now, the last thing to cover is a refresh card. When the user completes an action, the card body can be refreshed to include details of the interaction, such as if the expense approval number or the ticket that was approved. The way you're going to do this is you're going to have the second in the middle of the slide there in the code update, you'll see where it says refresh card. So here in this case, what you're going to do is add in a new header value of card update and body equal to true, and then you're going to return back a JSON object or a JSON string that's going to represent what the UI should look like in the mail client once it's actually been submitted. So this demonstration is going to show us how to use an actionable card to extend a expense approval program. So here's our actionable demo web application, and now this has given us the URL. As you saw in the previous demo, we actually specified how we wanted this to work. So right now it shows HTTP, but it also works with HTTPS. So I'm going to need that URL to register the next step. So I'm going to go to the Actionable Messages dashboard, and here's an application that I've already registered. So here I've got a name associated with it, like expense approval. There's the sender's email address, the target URL, and the scope of the submission. These are the most important parts. The first one is who sent the email. So Office is going to send a message to the URL endpoint, and it needs to know who is the email sender, who's it from. And so I need to register this email address. Now this is typically going to be a static email from someone. Now to create another user to go log in, what we're going to do is we're going to configure it for this demonstration to use their own email address. Now the target URL is the URL of the Azure web app that we would have created. And the scope of submission is my mailbox. Who is this going to be available for? So this is going to be able to send an actual message to my mailbox, but I won't be able to send it to any other user within my organization, or people like, say, at Outlook.com email addresses. If you want to do that, then I would need to choose one of the other two options, either organization for everybody in my organization or global. But then once I do that, if it's going organization or global, I am subject to authorization or verification from Microsoft. So in this case, for the demo, I'm just going to leave this in my mailbox to bypass that verification process. So I have an Azure web app that's been deployed. I've got my card that's been set up. Let's go jump over to the code inside of Visual Studio. And in the web config for my application, I've got three different things here that I want to show you: 13, 14, and 15, lines 13 through 15. So we have the sender email address, we have the email domain where the mail is coming from, and the registered action URL. And that's going to point to the Azure web app. So I'm pulling those values for our application to be able to function. So I'm going to rely on a NuGet package, which is going to help us verify the OAuth token that's going to be sent from Office to our application. So I'm going to right click on the project and say Manage NuGet Packages. And if I go to a search for Microsoft.O365, here we have our Actionable Messages NuGet package. This NuGet package is going to help us to do additional verification against the OAuth token that's sent from Microsoft. So let's go look at the code inside of our expense controller.cs file. So we have a web API controller. Now in our web app, we don't have the authorized attribute anywhere. It's an anonymous message that's being submitted. And since it's an anonymous message, we're going to need to verify the message based on the OAuth token that O365 and Office is going to send us. So I've got a helper method here called actionable message helper.validate token async. So let's jump to the definition of this and see what this does. Inside of this, we're going to take the entire HTTP request message. We're going to get the settings from our web config, the sender, the email domain, and the registered action URL. The first bit of validation that I'm going to do is to verify that I actually have a bearer token that was submitted. So I'm checking to see if there's anything in the authorization header. If we do, then check to see if it's got the bearer as a value. So if we don't have that token, then we're going to toss back an error because I have to have something to be able to authorize. And here you can see I'm just throwing like unauthorized if it's not there. Now I'm going to validate the token. Now the validation part of the token is going to be using the actionable message token validator. That's coming from that NuGet package. And so here I'm passing in the value of that bearer token and the registered action URL. That will reach into the OAuth token. It will decode the OAuth token and it'll verify the parameter and the actionable URL match the value that's sent from the token. If they don't match, then I'm going to kick back a invalid token message. Now we can do some additional validation. So the additional validation is going to allow us to verify against the static email address that we registered in the portal. So this would ensure us that we not only got a message and it was to a registered endpoint, but we want to verify, was it from that static email address that was in the portal? So here I can validate that. I can also validate the performer. Who's the one that actually clicked on the email? So here I can check to see who actually submitted it. So I can see, are they even allowed to perform this action? And so if they're not, then I'm going to throw back a HTTP status code of forbidden, saying they can't do it. Now, if all those things pass, so I've gotten a token, it's from Office, it's from the right sender, and the sender has permissions to do this, then we're going to send back a result. And you can see here what we're doing in each one of these. We're creating a card response. A card response is going to add an HTTP header, and it's either going to create a header with a success or an error response based on whatever the error is that's created. And so you can see the card action status is what's going to be the status of our response that we want to kick back. Some of these are going to return back a body. By returning back the body, we'll be able to refresh the card. If we want to show something like after they've clicked their approve button, we can actually show some additional information. So we can have a header that's going to have a body that'll refresh inside the body of the card. So let's look at this refresh card that it's actually creating. So if I go look at my refresh card in the refresh.json file, this refresh card is, like I said, just simply JSON. And so what this is going to use is our creator start group, which is going to have an image, a title, and a subtitle. If you look down at the facts, we're going to hard code some stuff just to show where the values came from. So here we can see the date submitted is listed, and then I have some dynamic values in there. So like the process date, the performer, you can see the details of the amount that are being approved. And you may want to replace, you're going to want to replace these static things in your own application. So that's what's submitted back to Office, and that Office will refresh. So if I go back to my controller, so the way this is going to be worked is that it's going to create an HTTP response. Was it approved? If it was, then we're going to create a response and say it was approved. Otherwise, if it was declined, we're going to create a different card and hand back the card that's going to indicate that it was declined. And then finally, the way that we're going to send the card back in the body is by using the HTTP header card update in body, set that to the value of true, and then tell it what is the card body. So I'm going to create it by using the actionable message helper. So we've seen how to get an HTTP message and process the OAuth token and validate it, and also how to send a response back to the caller. The last thing that I need to show you is to see this working. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to publish the application and click publish. And this is going to create a new profile to publish to our Azure app service. I'm not going to use a new one. I'm going to select an existing because I already have that. So I'm logged in. I'm going to go see my Azure web apps. So there's my actionable demo. Now, one of the things I want to do is I want to change some of the settings for this. So settings is right there on the far right-hand side. And if I click on that, what I'm going to want to do is go to the settings button in the publish tab. I'm going to change this to debug. And what this is going to allow us to do is to attach and debug our Azure web app. So I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to go ahead and click publish. This is going to publish our code to the Azure web app. So now we have an Azure web app that's sitting there and waiting for posts to come in. So let's go back to our web app inside of Visual Studio. I'm going to right click it and say I'm going to attach the debugger. And because I debugged it, or I deployed it as a debug mode, then it's going to allow me to attach to the application while it's running up in Azure from my local Visual Studio instance. So let's go over to our expense controller. Let's have a breakpoint set here on line 16. So I'll be able to see the token that's being valid asynchronously. So let's send ourselves an email. So I'm going to come over here to PowerShell. So let's use the same PowerShell we used in our previous demo. So that previous demo, we sent ourselves a message card. I'm going to do the exact same thing here. So it's going to ask us first what the from address is. So I'm going to use my email address. My target is going to be the same. I'm going to send it myself, and then it's going to ask me to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and log in using my credentials. And then that will send us an email with a card into our inbox. So if I jump back over to my mail and I wait for a second for the email to show up. Okay, so our email has just shown up here. So I'll click on the email. You can see the details of the card are listed here. So we have our approve and reject buttons as we've seen before. So I'm going to go ahead and expand approve. Here's the reason for the approval. So let's just say this is an awesome demo. Now, before I click submit, now where did the source for this card come? So if I go back to Visual Studio, if I look at the card sample.json, just remember that the way that this happened was that I had this card sample JSON that was submit to the application via email, and that was done using PowerShell, if you remember. And in the action for that card, we have an action named approve, and it's an HTTP post that's posting to our Azure web app that we were just looking at a second ago that we've stood up. So that now when I click approve, it would be submitting it to our expense controller. So you can see that there's our expense controller with an ID and an action approve. So let's go back and let's click submit. Now we click submit. That should jump over to our expense controller, and there we can see we hit our breakpoint for the application that's running up in an Azure web app. So we can see there's the ID is 9876 and the URI action is approve. So let's step into our actionable message helper to validate the token. So let's look at the request.headers authorization. So we can look at the validator. It's validating the token asynchronously. So there's the parameter. Yep, there's our OAuth token that we can see it came across. So code is validating it, making sure that it's fine. Did it succeed? Yep. So we'll just go ahead and hit F5 to go ahead and continue. And so our result, we can see now that the approve and reject buttons are gone. Instead, it's changed to where it's come back. It's showing everything from our refresh card. So you can see that it shows it's been approved. It shows it was submitted, when it was processed, who processed it, and the details, which were hard-coded. But remember, there was a couple of them that were dynamic. So we had some of the dates in there were a little bit different. The times in there were a little bit different. And you can see that the approve and reject are gone as well. So you can see you couldn't go back because it stays with that message. I can't show the two different buttons. It wouldn't be a complete module until we actually talk a little bit about some best practices for actionable messages. So here, let's talk about card design, security, and adoption processing or action processing. So for the card design, we want to use, for the informational stuff that we pass across, we want to be able to use the hide original body card property if the card itself contains all the information the user would need, or if the content of the card is redundant with the content of the body. Always include an HTML body in the email, as that's going to be rendered out for email clients that don't support cards at this time. You should always include a summary, but don't include sentences in the summary. As far as hyperlinks go, don't use them in the title. You should use the OpenURI action to enable device-specific URL handling. As for the card body, don't use HTML markup within the card. Use the theme color property to brand your cards, but don't use it to indicate status. Avoid markdown and activity fields within the card, and fact values should provide metadata, avoiding writing sentences within facts. Now let's talk a little bit about security. If you're using actionable email, check that your email servers are leveraging SPF and DKIM as an additional safeguard against email spoofing. Your service must be registered through Microsoft, and the action URLs must be HTTPS. As far as action processing phase, you should verify the bearer token, and you should include a limited purpose token from your service as part of the target URL. That can easily be used by your service to correlate the service URL with the intended request and the intended user. Now, as far as the actions go, let's validate the bearer token and verify the sender is the same as the one that's registered. Use a static email address as the sender. Don't try to use cards to replace external applications. Cards are meant to complement applications, not replace them. Do not try to use cards as multi-step wizards either. Always use the OpenURI action as the last potential action in a list to at least open the original application's URL. Return the card action status HTTP header in your response, and make the status message something meaningful. You should not include personal data in the status message. And then finally, use an OpenURI action in a response message containing a refresh card to allow the user to open it in an external app that it comes from. So in this module, we looked at cards and actions using Outlook Actionable Messages and how we can use them within our applications.